The genesis of the machine that would eventually shatter the Japanese defensive perimeter in the Pacific began not in a military laboratory or a naval shipyard, but in the terrifying, wind-whipped darkness of the Florida Everglades on September 2, 1935, when the most powerful hurricane ever to strike the United States made landfall with a ferocity that defied measurement. The Labor Day hurricane turned the vast, swampy expanse of the Okeechobee region into a chaotic death trap where the boundary between land and water ceased to exist, creating a humanitarian nightmare that haunted the conscience of the nation, and specifically the mind of Donald Roebling, a wealthy, eccentric engineer living in Clearwater, whose family name was already etched into American history through his grandfather, Washington Roebling, the builder of the Brooklyn Bridge. As reports trickled in of rescue workers standing helplessly on the edges of the flooded mangrove swamps, unable to reach the victims screaming for help in the interior, Roebling realized that the existing technology of salvation was fundamentally broken because standard boats ran aground on the hidden mudbanks and submerged tree roots, while wheeled vehicles sank instantly into the muck, leaving the survivors to die of exposure or drowning in a limbo where neither boat nor car could travel. Motivated by a pure, pacifist desire to conquer the geography of disaster, Roebling retreated to his sprawling machine shop with a singular obsession: to create a vehicle that did not respect the distinction between solid ground and liquid water, a mechanical chimera that could crawl through a swamp as easily as it floated on a river. The engineering challenge was immense, requiring a complete rethinking of propulsion, leading Roebling to reject the traditional propeller or rudder in favor of a revolutionary track system where the cleats were not flat pads but curved aluminum paddles that acted as cupped hands to scoop the water when afloat and as gripping claws when on land. He utilized duralumin, a lightweight, aircraft-grade aluminum alloy, to construct the hull because steel would have been too heavy to remain buoyant, creating a boxy, unglamorous machine that looked like a floating dumpster but possessed the agility of the reptile for which it was named, the alligator. By 1937, Roebling had perfected his prototype, a noisy, rattling beast powered by a Ford V8 engine that could tear through the thickest sawgrass and climb over fallen logs without pausing, a feat that was captured in a fateful issue of Life magazine, which presented the alligator as a tool of mercy for the hurricane belt. However, thousands of miles away in Quantico, Virginia, that magazine landed on the desk of Brigadier General Emil Moses of the United States Marine Corps, a visionary officer who was losing sleep over a very different problem: the looming war with Japan and the terrifying geography of the Pacific Atolls. Moses knew what the Navy refused to admit, which was that the standard landing craft of the day, the wooden-hulled Higgins boats, were fatally flawed for the coming conflict because they required deep water to float and a sandy beach to land, meaning that any coral reef acting as a barrier offshore would stop the invasion force dead in the water, forcing Marines to wade hundreds of yards through chest-deep surf into the teeth of enemy fire. When Moses looked at Roebling's hurricane rescue boat, he didn't see a humanitarian tool. He saw the solution to the reef problem, a vehicle that could swim over the coral and drive up the beach, bypassing the kill zone entirely. The collision between these two worlds, the wealthy, altruistic inventor and the pragmatic, desperate general, occurred in 1940 when Moses arrived at Roebling's estate to witness a demonstration, watching in awe as the alligator roared out of the bay, hit the mudflat at full speed, and clawed its way up a steep embankment, crushing the vegetation under its tracks with a violence that made the general smile. Roebling was initially horrified by the military interest, protesting that his creation was designed to save lives, not to take them, and he argued that the aluminum hull was far too thin to stop a bullet and that the tracks were designed for swamp grass, not for the abrasive, razor-sharp coral of a combat zone. He feared the corruption of his design, foreseeing that the military would weigh it down with armor and guns until it sank. But Moses was relentless, appealing to Roebling's patriotism and the grim logic that the only way to save American lives in the future was to possess a machine that could deliver them safely onto a hostile shore. After the attack on Pearl Harbor, the moral debate ended, and Roebling's workshop was transformed from a rich man's hobby shop into the birthplace of the LVT, landing vehicle tracked, marking the ironic and tragic beginning of the swamp ghost's journey from the peaceful mangroves of Florida to the blood-soaked reefs of the Pacific, where the vehicle designed to rescue hurricane victims would soon be asked to carry young men into the man-made storm of total war. The morning of November 20th, 1943 dawned over the Bedio Islet in the Tarawa Atoll with a deceptive serenity. The sky a brilliant, cloudless cobalt that belied the man-made apocalypse about to unfold on the surface of the lagoon, where the theories of amphibious warfare were about to collide with the brutal realities of hydrography in a disaster that would scar the soul of the Marine Corps forever. The plan devised by the tactical planners was a symphony of violence predicated on a single critical variable, the tide, which the calculations of the naval hydrographers predicted would rise high enough by 0900 hours to allow the flat-bottomed Higgins boats, LCVPs, dragging 4 feet of water, to float over the jagged coral reef that encircled the island like a medieval moat. However, nature, indifferent to the schedules of men, delivered a neap tide, a rare and unpredictable phenomenon where the gravitational pull of the moon and sun canceled each other out, leaving the water over the reef stagnant at a shallow depth of barely 3 feet, a fatal miscalculation that turned the lagoon into a slaughterhouse. Private First Class Miller, crouched in the heaving belly of a Higgins boat in the 4th wave, felt the adrenaline sour and to nausea as the engine roared and the coxswain steered toward the smoking palm trees of Red Beach 2, believing that the massive naval bombardment had pulverized the Japanese defenders. But as the boat surged forward, there was a sickening grinding crunch that vibrated through the hull, not the soft slide of sand, but the harsh skeletal scrape of wood against coral rock. The boat shuddered and stopped dead, its engine whining in futile protest 500 yards from the shore. The coxswain screamed the order that every Marine dreaded: "Reefed, everybody out, you have to wade." Miller looked over the gunwale and saw a nightmare. The water was not a protective depth, but a waist-high expanse of churned white foam that offered no cover, and ahead of him, the suppressed Japanese garrison was alive, manning their Type 92 heavy machine guns and 47mm anti-boat guns with disciplined fury. As the ramp dropped, Miller stepped into the water and instantly felt the drag of his equipment, his soaked dungarees and ammunition belts turning him into a slow-moving target in a shooting gallery where the enemy couldn't miss. The slaughter that followed was mechanical and relentless. Thousands of Marines were forced to perform a slow-motion death march through the lagoon, the water around them turning a milty pink and then a deep, opaque crimson as entire squads were cut down before they could fire a single shot. The bullets hissed into the water like angry hornets, and the air was filled with the chaotic noise of screaming men and exploding mortar shells, creating a scene of carnage so absolute that it seemed the invasion had failed before it reached dry land. Yet, amidst this tableau of destruction, there was a surreal anomaly, a stark technological contrast that proved the validity of Donald Roebling's vision. Leading the very first waves were not the Higgins boats, but a motley collection of LVT Alligators, the unarmored logistical versions of the amphibious tractor. To the eyes of the Japanese defenders, these vehicles were terrifying mechanical monsters, their tracks churning the water with a distinctive clatter as they approached the reef that had stopped the boats. Instead of grounding, the LVTs simply kept coming. Their curved aluminum cleats bit into the coral rock, the tracks found traction on the slippery surface, and the machines heaved themselves up and over the barrier like amphibious tanks, dropping into the lagoon on the other side and continuing relentlessly toward the beach. The Marines inside the LVTs were dry, mobile, and protected from the small arms fire that was decimating their comrades in the water. And as the tractors crawled up onto the sand of Bedio, they delivered their troops directly into the fight, bypassing the kill zone of the lagoon entirely. The tragedy of Tarawa was not that the technology failed, but that there wasn't enough of it. Only the first 3 waves were equipped with LVTs, while the remaining waves were consigned to the Higgins boats and the horror of the wading assault. Miller, miraculously reaching the seawall while his friends floated face down in the lagoon behind him, watched an LVT burn on the beach, its thin skin pierced by a heavy caliber round because it lacked armor, but he realized with a survivor's clarity that the ugly, noisy machine was the only reason the Marines had a foothold at all. The ocean had become a wall, and the Higgins boat had failed to climb it, leaving the swamp rescue vehicle as the only key that could unlock the door to the Japanese Empire. As the sun set on a beach piled high with bodies, the message was written in blood for the admirals to see. The era of the boat was over, and if the United States wanted to win the Pacific, they would need to build thousands of these mechanical alligators, and they would need to wrap them in steel. The after-action reports from Tarawa arrived in Washington, D.C. not as dry stacks of paper, but as a scream of collective outrage from the Marine Corps, detailing the horrific cost of sending soft-skinned vehicles into a hardened kill zone. General Holland "Howlin' Mad" Smith, reading the casualty lists that included over 3,000 dead and wounded in just 76 hours, issued a directive that effectively ended the era of the wading assault. No Marine will ever walk across a reef again. The mandate was absolute, but the engineering reality was terrifyingly complex, for the LVT-1 Alligator that Donald Roebling had designed was never intended to be a tank. It was a rescue boat made of lightweight mild steel and duralumin, designed to float over flooded golf courses, not to deflect 7.7mm armor-piercing rounds. The Marines on Tarawa had dubbed the unarmored LVTs suicide crates because the thin hull plating could be penetrated by high-velocity rifle fire, turning the interior into a ricochet chamber of shrapnel and spalling metal. The challenge facing the engineers at the Food Machinery Corporation, FMC, in San Jose and Riverside was a brutal lesson in the physics of buoyancy. They had to take a vehicle that barely floated and bolt tons of steel armor onto it without causing it to sink to the bottom of the ocean. The timeline was non-existent. The invasion of the Marianas was scheduled for the summer of 1944, giving them only months to transform a logistical carrier into a weapon of assault. The result was a frenzy of industrial improvisation that birthed a new species of mechanical violence known as the AmTank. The first iteration, the LVT-A1, was a Frankenstein's monster of spare parts and desperate ingenuity. The engineers took the turret of an M3 Stuart light tank, complete with its 37mm cannon, and grafted it onto the roof of the LVT, converting the open-topped cargo bay into a sealed, armored fighting compartment. To protect the hull, they welded 6mm and 12mm steel plates over the vital areas, adding weight that strained the suspension and forced the replacement of the original Ford engine with a massive radial Continental W670 aircraft engine, the same power plant used in training planes, which roared with a deafening air-cooled fury. But the true revolution came with the development of the LVT-4 Water Buffalo, a redesign that addressed the fatal flaw of the original Alligator. On the old models, the engine was in the rear, forcing the Marines to jump over the high sides of the vehicle to disembark, leaving them exposed to enemy fire in their most vulnerable moment. The engineers at FMC performed a radical surgery, moving the engine to the front of the vehicle directly behind the driver and installing a massive drop-down ramp at the rear. This simple change transformed the tactical utility of the machine. Now, the LVT could drive up the beach, spin around, and drop its ramp, allowing a jeep, a howitzer, or a squad of 30 Marines to charge out under the cover of the vehicle's own armor, protected until the very last second. The factories in California and Florida shifted to a 24-hour war footing, the air thick with the smell of ozone from arc welders, as thousands of workers, many of them women, assembled the hulls with a speed that rivaled the automotive assembly lines of Detroit. They were building a fleet of amphibious tanks. They were ugly, ungainly, and deafeningly loud,
vibrating so violently that crews often lost the feeling in their hands. But they were machines that could ignore the geography of the shoreline. The swamp ghost had shed its pacifist skin. It was no longer the humanitarian invention of Donald Roebling designed to save hurricane victims. It was now a hardened carapace of war, bristling with 50-caliber machine guns and flamethrowers, painted in the dark, non-reflective blue of the Navy or the camouflage patterns of the Marines. The Alligator had evolved into a predator, and as the new models rolled off the flat cars to be loaded onto the transport ships, they represented a fundamental shift in the philosophy of the Pacific War. The United States was no longer just going to land on the beaches. They were going to drive over them, bringing their own cover with them, turning the surf zone from a place of slaughter into a highway of invasion. The Japanese commanders, still analyzing the victory of the coral reefs at Tarawa, believed they had found the American weakness. They did not know that the Americans had simply gone back to the shop and built a mechanical solution that would render the reef irrelevant.
By the morning of June 15, 1944, the island of Saipan in the Marianas had been transformed by the Japanese 31st Army into a fortress that was theoretically impregnable, a jagged spine of volcanic rock and limestone surrounded by a coral reef that was even more treacherous than the one at Tarawa. Captain Sato, a company commander in the 136th Infantry Regiment, peered through the slit of his concrete pillbox, overlooking the landing beaches at Chiran Kanoa, feeling a grim confidence rooted in the geography of the kill zone. He had studied the reports from Tarawa meticulously, and his defensive plan was predicated on a specific sequence of events. The American boats would hit the reef 600 yards out, the Marines would be forced to wade through the chest-deep water, and his pre-sighted heavy machine guns, firing interlocking bands of fire, would annihilate them long before they reached the dry sand. Sato watched the horizon, where the massive American invasion fleet filled the ocean, waiting for the moment when the landing craft would drop their ramps at the reef's edge, signaling the beginning of the slaughter. But as the naval bombardment lifted, leaving the palm trees shattered and smoking, Sato saw something that defied his understanding of amphibious warfare. The first wave was not composed of the flat-bottomed boats he expected, but of hundreds of strange, boxy shapes that sat low in the water, churning toward the shore with a terrifying rhythmic roar. These were the AM-tanks, the LVT-A1s, and the new LVT-A4s armed with 75mm howitzers, serving as the vanguard for the troop carriers behind them. As they approached the white line of breaking surf, where the reef rose from the depths, Sato ordered his men to hold fire, waiting for the vehicles to ground out and become stationary targets. They never stopped. Inside Lucky Lady, an LVT-4 of the 2nd Armored Amphibian Battalion, Corporal Tex Miller gripped the handles of his .30 caliber machine gun, his body vibrating in sync with the violent shudder of the Continental aircraft engine, screaming just behind his back. The interior of the LVT was a sensory hell of deafening noise, blue exhaust smoke, and the metallic heat of an oven. But to Tex, who had survived the waiting nightmare of Tarawa, this steel box was a sanctuary. He felt the vehicle pitch up violently as the tracks made contact with the coral, the aluminum cleats grinding against the limestone with a sound like 1,000 chainsaws cutting through bone. Instead of getting stuck, the Lucky Lady simply lurched forward, its tracks finding purchase on the jagged rock, heaving the 7-ton beast up out of the deep water and onto the reef flat. Tex watched through the vision slit as the water dropped away, and suddenly they were no longer a boat, they were a tank driving on a wet highway. Ahead of them, the LVT-A's opened fire, their turret-mounted cannons blasting the Japanese pillboxes at point-blank range while moving at 6 knots, a feat of mobile firepower that the Japanese had never encountered. Captain Sato watched in horror as the boats he was supposed to sink simply crawled over the barrier that was the cornerstone of his defense. The mathematical certainty of his kill zone evaporated instantly. He couldn't target a waiting line of infantry because there was no waiting. The vehicles crossed the 600 yards of lagoon in minutes, immune to the Nambu machine gun fire that pinged harmlessly off their 12mm steel hulls and roared up onto the beach. But the true shock came when the LVTs hit the sand. In the old doctrine, the landing craft would drop their ramps at the water's edge, leaving the Marines to sprint across the most dangerous strip of beach exposed to fire. At Saipan, the LVTs didn't stop at the water. They drove through the beach defense line, crushing the barbed wire and sandbags under their tracks, pushing inland to the cover of the tree line before turning around. The rear ramp of the Lucky Lady dropped with a hydraulic hiss, and 30 Marines charged out, not into the surf, but onto solid ground, their boots dry and their weapons clean, already behind the first line of Japanese defenses. It was a complete tactical subversion. The water's edge, which had been the line of death in every previous amphibious assault, had been rendered irrelevant by a machine that refused to acknowledge the transition from sea to land. Sato realized with a sinking heart that his fixed fortifications were useless against an enemy who brought his own mobile cover. The swamp ghost had turned the coral reef from a fortress wall into a paved highway, and as thousands of LVTs poured onto the island like a colony of mechanized ants, delivering tanks, artillery, and men deep into the Japanese rear, the battle for the beach was lost before a single Japanese soldier could fix a bayonet. The Americans had not just landed, they had overrun the geography itself.
By February 1945, the geography of the Pacific War had shifted from the razor-sharp coral of the Marianas to the surreal alien landscape of Iwo Jima, an island composed not of rock but of loose volcanic ash that possessed the consistency of coarse coffee grounds and the sucking power of quicksand. When the Marines of the 4th and 5th Divisions hit the beaches under the brooding shadow of Mount Suribachi, the reef problem of Tarawa was instantly replaced by the traction problem of the black sand, a geological nightmare that immobilized every wheeled vehicle the Americans attempted to land within minutes of their arrival. The jeeps, the 2.5-ton trucks, and even the Sherman tanks found themselves burying their axles in the soft grit, their wheels spinning helplessly as they became static coffins for Japanese mortars to bracket, creating a logistical bottleneck that threatened to strangle the invasion on the waterline. It was here, in this monochromatic hellscape, where the ground itself seemed to be fighting against the invaders, that the LVT achieved its final and most noble evolution, transforming from a mere assault vehicle into the singular lifeline of the entire operation. We witnessed the chaos through the bloodshot eyes of Corporal Sully Sullivan, a driver of an LVT-4 water buffalo, who found himself running a continuous, sleepless shuttle service between the supply ships in the front lines. The LVT was the only machine capable of floating over the volcanic ash, its wide paddle tracks distributing its weight so effectively that it skimmed the surface where men sank to their ankles and trucks sank to their frames. But the mission had changed fundamentally. Sully wasn't just carrying riflemen to kill the enemy, he was carrying the currency of life itself. On the inbound trips, his cargo bay was stacked high with crates of plasma, morphine, and flamethrower fuel, the essential commodities required to keep the offensive moving inch by bloody inch. However, it was on the return trips that the swamp ghost truly reclaimed its original soul. When Sully dropped the rear ramp near the aid stations, it wasn't to unleash a squad of killers, but to load a tragic cargo of broken bodies. The LVT, with its spacious rear cargo bay protected by high steel walls, became a hardened ambulance, the only viable method to evacuate the catastrophic number of casualties from the meat grinder of the interior back to the hospital ships waiting offshore. We see Sully maneuvering his beast through a heavy mortar barrage, the steel hull ringing with the impact of shrapnel like a struck bell, as corpsmen frantically work on a wounded Marine in the back, the vehicle acting as a mobile operating room in a landscape where standing still meant death. The swamp rescue boat had come full circle, returning to its humanitarian roots in the most violent place on Earth, fulfilling the promise that General Moses had made to Donald Roebling years earlier, that the machine would save American lives. Back in Florida, Roebling, who had once resisted the military application of his invention with a pacifist's zeal, received letters from the front lines,
Not from generals, but from the mothers of boys who had been pulled off the beaches of Saipan and Iwo Jima inside the belly of his alligators. He realized with a profound and quiet emotion that his creation had transcended the binary of war and peace. It was a tool of survival. The Japanese commanders, who had spent decades fortifying their islands with concrete bunkers and coastal guns, had been defeated not just by superior firepower, but by a piece of American civil engineering that rendered their terrain advantages obsolete. They had counted on the reefs to stop the boats, in the sand to stop the trucks, but they had no answer for a machine that ignored the laws of geography. As the war ended and the occupation began, thousands of LVTs were parked in long, rusting rows on the beaches of the Pacific, their job done. The final image of the narrative lingers on one such derelict LVT-4, half buried in the white sands of a forgotten atoll, the sea breeze slowly corroding the aluminum tracks that had once crawled over the impossible barriers of the empire. It stands as a silent iron monument to the swamp ghost, the strange, noisy, amphibious hybrid that began as a dream to save hurricane victims in the Everglades and ended up carrying the weight of the free world on its back, proving that in the crucible of total war, the most effective weapon was not the one designed to destroy, but the one designed to overcome the very Earth itself. The LVT didn't just change the tactics of the Marine Corps, it rewrote the map of the Pacific, turning the impassable into the inevitable and leaving a legacy that would be studied in military academies for a century, that at the water's edge, the only thing that matters is the ability to keep moving.